Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to this guest lecture in RG 2008, a course here within the Study of Religions department on One God, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The students this week are looking at redemption, salvation, and life after death, and we are very lucky to have Kyle speak to us about literal and metaphorical perspectives from long-term HIV survivors. So before we move to your presentation, a brief introduction to you, Kyle. I think I'm probably going to say your name wrong. Is it Desrosiers? Did I say that wrong?
Desrosiers.
Desrosiers. You're a Fulbright Fellow in the Conflict Resolution and Mediation graduate program at Tel Aviv University in Israel. Your research interests include death and dying, Marxism and religion, and religious conflict. And you're going to briefly discuss spiritual reports from long-term HIV survivors reclaiming meaning while confronting mortality, which you published in 2020 in Death at the Margins, a Religions Journal special issue. The research was completed at Baylor University Institute for Oral History in Texas in 2019, between 2019 and 2020, and you're going to discuss the relationship between and also your relationship between your vocation for religious studies and your experience as a queer Roman Catholic living in Israel, Palestine. So we're very excited to hear from you, Kyle. Thank you very much for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Aman. So you can hear me. Can you see the presentation right now? Does it look all right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Great. Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming here today. Right. So I know that in your course today you were reading about redemption, salvation, and life after death. And so Aman asked me to come and to share a bit about my research with you all, because I spent the last, before this year, but I spent about a year interviewing long-term HIV survivors in America about religion, spirituality, culture, and lifespan development, what their beliefs are, how they changed in responding to themselves, their religion, and their community as people living with HIV. So I wrote literal and metaphorical perspectives here because when you're talking about redemption, salvation, and life after death, a lot of times you're thinking of these religious terms. And I looked a bit in this chapter and I see, you thinking of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. What does life look like when you die? How does your actions in this life affect the next life? And what does the salvation of the world look like? For many of these HIV survivors, they interpreted these things in more metaphorical ways, thinking about how to make this life better, how to reconcile in this life. And some of them also thought about the afterlife. So you'll see as we go on this journey today. Okay. So you can see here the abstract from the article that I published in Religions about, I guess, 6 months ago now. And in this article, I looked at some of the different interviews from this whole body of interviews. And I profiled gay and queer men, though in the corpus of interviews, I had people with more gender identities, but here I had only the 5 and a Protestant minister. And I asked questions about how narratives changed over time, being HIV positive, life before the diagnosis, life after, and how people related to their communities and their religious beliefs, what stayed the same and what changed. I did this interview. It's an oral history, meaning that I was preserving spoken interviews with participants who were from the American South as well as California. And they were preserved oral interviews to record very first person, very subjective perspectives on HIV, especially among long-term survivors who may have been living with HIV since the 1980s or 1990s. So one of the big themes that I found was expanding worldviews in the face of mortality. So especially for people who were in America and received this diagnosis, in all countries, but specifically this was focusing on America context. People who live with HIV and AIDS have to confront their own mortality, and they have to confront perhaps losing their life very shorter than they would hope to, and then suffering and death among those who they love, such as was experienced in the gay community, and of course is still being experienced in poor communities and many places in the global South today. And yeah, when people are stigmatized by religion for any reason, they often have to re-examine these doctrines. So when we think about things like sexuality, gender identity, obviously there are sects in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, among other religions, that have teachings which argue that these human experiences will result in someone having a different afterlife or someone being punished in the afterlife. And these theologies cause a lot of trauma and a lot of pain. And of course, there are many, many sects in these religions that say against this, that offer a story that doesn't believe that these identities are worthy of punishment. But nonetheless, there are beliefs about salvation and the afterlife that relate to HIV. And if you look at the rhetoric from a lot of ministers in the 1980s and the 1990s, you can see that across many religious denominations, there were lots of teachings about how HIV related to salvation, the afterlife, and the end of the world. And it caused a lot of gay and queer people, as well as people who were not, trauma, pain, and violence, and motivated a culture where healthcare and political motivations for resources meant that more people died than had to. And a lot of scholars have argued, such as Randy Schiltz, have argued that it's because of these religious teachings that the epidemic was worse than it had to be, which is very unfortunate. So one person I'd like to introduce you to is Michael. He is a 59-year-old white Jewish gay man from Los Angeles. I'll read you his quote right now. I think that having lived with HIV/AIDS and having lost so many friends and having been through all of that, I think that I have a depth of compassion that I would not have had otherwise. In that respect, maybe in some way, it's a gift. I mean, I would never wish it on anybody, but there is something that is my depth of compassion. My capacity to have that kind of compassion is something I really value and genuinely don't think I'd have had without these experiences. Maybe when you reach the deepest depths of despair, and sorry, I'm having trouble seeing the rest of the slide. But when you reach the highs and the lows, he's saying that that's central to human experience, and hopefully you can read it. Something's odd with this application. But yeah, so I asked Michael in the middle of the interview, how does he think his life was different, his spiritual life, was different for having HIV. And, I think it's worth noting that people who live with HIV or any kind of disease and disabilities should neither be seen as people who deserve pity, or should they be seen as someone who you fetishize for, their spirituality because of their suffering, but rather as people who, like everyone else, has spiritual experiences, and the condition of living with HIV meant that they really had to evaluate spiritual experiences and cultural and religious teachings much more than people who haven't endured that kind of stigmatization or victimization have. And Michael said that in his experiences, he told me he lost dozens of friends, a funeral every week. He lost his partner. He told me this anecdote from 1984, sitting in a coffee shop with his friend group, reading the newspaper about what was being called gay cancer. And he told me that they all laughed. They thought it couldn't be, that it was just this fear of the mainstream media. But he told me that in a few short years, he was the only one at that table who was still alive, that all of his friends who were there that night were dead from HIV/AIDS. And through that experience, he reconnected with his Judaism after his father's death, and says that it taught him compassion. We can move on. I will now introduce you to Ron. Ron is one of my younger participants. He is a 35-year-old Black gay man. He was raised Roman Catholic in Louisiana. And you can read his quote here. He questioned his faith in God utterly. He was very young when he left home. He grew up very poor. He was raised by his grandmother and raised very religious. And when he got the diagnosis, he said, part of my guilt was linked to that too, because I was like, well, maybe if I had just lived a more wholesome life. And I apologized to God. I remember praying and apologized, and I even felt ridiculous at the time because I was like, you don't owe me anything. And I had a breakdown. I thought that was a punishment. I thought that an HIV diagnosis was my punishment for being gay, and that it was God's doing. And this is the message that he received. He told me that his family was devout. He was an altar boy. And he said that the expectations for gender performance in his community, which is mostly poor and mostly Black, were very rigid. And that he was enduring marginalization and stigmatization for that before he came out and before he received his HIV diagnosis. And for him, it was a very intimate experience where he was wrestling with the Christian God and what he was told Christianity was. And coming to the theme of redemption and punishment, he thought it was a punishment from God, which is the language that many people I interviewed said that they went through when they were thinking about the diagnosis with respect to their religious upbringings. The next person I want to introduce you to is Marla. And again, I apologize for not having photographs here. There is, concern about anonymity, but I think eventually it would be very interesting to profile people's stories with images from them. But in any case, this is Marla. She's 55 years old. She is Jewish and Latina, and she is the only straight woman that I interviewed. She's from San Francisco. When I spoke to Marla, she told me about her upbringing in a pretty conservative home in Orange County, and how she was actually conditioned and taught to fear gay people. And she moved to San Francisco in the 1980s. So she had to confront her biases. And I think she credits much of that to her journey becoming HIV positive. And I'll read you a bit of her quote. She says, "I think if I didn't become HIV positive, I would have taken a completely different journey. I was, well, this is kind of a weird story, but I was pregnant and supposed to deliver a baby. I was supposed to have that baby the month I contracted HIV, and my mother bullied me into getting an abortion. She bullied me into getting an abortion, and that was the month I was supposed to deliver that baby is the month I contracted HIV. So that, to me, is a very clear fork in the road, and I chose on a subconscious level the HIV road rather than the baby." And she thinks she had this fork, and whether it was a punishment from God or a punishment from her overbearing mother, for Marla, it was a very spiritual moment in which she thinks she had the subconscious choice, and she dealt with regret of this moment for a very long time. And we'll move on to the next person. The last person that I want to talk about with respect to excuse me, to these moments in which they are coping with the diagnosis is Rob. And Rob is 56. He's a white gay man who was raised in the Latter-day Saints, known as Mormon Church, and he's from Dallas. And he told me about how he went to reconditioning therapy and really experienced very traumatic violence, emotional, and even a bit of physical violence in this reconditioning therapy to change his sexual orientation. And before that, he had gone on his 2-year mission that members of the LDS Church, especially men, are expected to serve. And he went to Japan. And on that mission, he says something about how he was supposed to teach the Japanese people the gospel, but instead he learned more from them. And he found the Japanese culture more beautiful. And in Japan, he had his first kiss with this man who was a Japanese elder, and he wasn't old. Elder is just the title in the LDS Church, and he had this moment of intimacy. And he says, even at 19 years old, it felt to him so God-given and so whole. And at the same time, he was discovering this Japanese culture he loved, that he knew it couldn't be wrong, that he felt connected to God in that intimacy. And he carried that with him through the rest of his life as he wrestled with his faith. He wrestled with the church and left it, and later became HIV positive and lost his partner and lost a lot of his community. And he talked about his happy accident, his first kiss, very innocent, very chaste story. And he talked about it, and that was more important to him of a turning point than when he discovered that he was HIV positive. So about that, he says, "Sometimes I wonder how many people get those accidents. Bumping into that first kiss. I mean, that epiphany. That could have taken a lot longer. They didn't realize they gave me that. Also, you really need help from other people. And I was so grateful for the friends that were wiser, that helped me see myself and give me ideas that I could experiment with and use in my life. It's a continual opening up. It's amazing, and it's so much more interesting than that journey. He talks about his journey in the church, which was a dead end one-way street. It's much more interesting to stay spiritually alive and just keep asking questions and revising your scope. Oh, sorry about that. And there's one person left in this section, who is Jesus, and he's 59 years old, gay Mexican American man, and he was also raised Roman Catholic. And when I spoke to Jesus, he talked a lot about how when he was young, his community also had very rigid gender and sexuality norms. And when he came to America, he felt, he came from Mexico, when he came to America in his 20s, that he was able to experience more and find more freedom. And he was in San Francisco. And he felt that it was a very spiritual experience, sort of how people pray or read scripture, or participate in rituals. He felt that, and going to meet gay people and engaging in community, doing political activism for gay rights, going to the parties, dancing, he felt that this became his religious ritual. And he used language that was a bit like reconciliation and renewal, which are terms we're talking about today. And then HIV came, and it changed everything. And Jesus, who had a lot of spiritual trauma from his childhood, also expressed that he felt that it was punishment, for who he was and for what he was. And, he and other people report that they have mental health concerns to this day, because of those messagings. And Jesus talks also about how he lost so much of his community because he was very active in the community where he lived. And again, he's reporting about what it's like to be a long-term survivor and to arrive at a point where there's medication that can sustain his life. And he lives with chronic pain, peripheral neuropathy. And he wrestles with these questions about a more metaphorical sense of salvation, fixing the world, making the world whole, which is, how a lot of people interpret the Bible and the Quran. When they think about salvation, they think about how the world is made whole, whatever that means, the Messiah, the future coming of God's kingdom. And here he thinks about making the world whole here on earth. And a lot of people who really were so marginalized by their institutional religions found in activism, whether it was political activism, volunteering to take care of HIV patients, such as a lot of the lesbian community came and took care of a lot of the gay men who were dying. Or whether it was ACT UP or other organizations, people found a new sense of salvation there. And today, Jesus still ponders why he survived. And because he survived, he says he continues to do this sacred act of his activism and his service. And he does a lot with the community who deals with chronic pain and neuropathy. And he also considers himself a shaman. So he really connected with his indigenous practices of his ancestors, and doesn't so much identify with Christianity anymore. And so I'll read his quote. Why am I here and these other people didn't? So what I can tell you is I still feel that I have to do good for others because I'm here. And I don't have to, but it's like part of me is like, even if I suffer from chronic pain or whatever, I'm still here. I'm lucky to enjoy this view I'm looking at. I'm lucky to be talking to you. I'm lucky. And in response to what they would identify as failures and incompleteness of rigid structures and practices, a lot of the participants reported that as they confronted their mortality, cope with loss, and watched their loved ones suffer, they made new spiritualities or they reclaimed their spiritualities. Interestingly, where the participants who were Roman Catholic, Latter-day Saints, or conservative Protestant, virtually all of them did no longer identify with those identities. But the ones who were coming from a Jewish identity, particularly Reform or conservative in the US, still found that they could identify with Judaism because it didn't do them as much trauma as a lot of the organized Christian sects. And unfortunately, I didn't get to speak to any Muslims, and I maybe will add to the corpus of interviews soon. And because of this, the participants sought more complete stories. So reconciliation and redemption with God, or with meaning, or with the universe, in sometimes literal and sometimes metaphorical ways. Right, so I probably won't read all of these quotes for the sake of time, but I'll read a couple. So again, we hear from Jesus, who is a shaman, and I'll read his quote. Usually shamans are about being a healer or a warrior, and still, even in this concept, you have to decide who you are. And in my case, I have always felt that I'm not exactly neither of those two exact terms. And that's how life works. It's not just sometimes one little thing. For me, I always have felt that I am a bridge, a person who makes connections in many ways that's different, in many ways different between people and other ways of thinking or other kinds of people. I love doing that, maybe because I like it, maybe because it is part of me and my DNA. And in striving to reconcile himself with God, with the universe, Jesus is both doing rituals that might be considered bridging between the physical world and the spiritual world, but also he's the kind of person who has many friends and really feels like he can bring people together. So in this way, it's both a physical and a sort of spiritual experience of bridging as a shaman, as he connects with the indigenous practices of his ancestors. Okay, right. So I'll tell you a little bit about Marla, who we heard from a bit earlier. She, though, is Jewish and does serves in her synagogue and helps serve a Shabbat lunch for people living with chronic illness. She doesn't like to pray and she doesn't like liturgy, but she has, through her reading, developed a very complex thought about the afterlife. Marla is actually going to be publishing a novel soon that I had the privilege of, what do you call it? I read the novel and I gave a little bit of feedback. I think she called it a beta reader or something. And that was very cool. And she's writing about her afterlife, her views on afterlife. When she tested HIV positive and later found out that her boyfriend had died of AIDS, she went to Israel. She went and lived on a kibbutz, and they kicked her off once they found out she was HIV positive. And she wandered in Israel and in Egypt, and always was seeking answers to these questions about redemption, how she could find redemption in her life. She told me that she's never had long-term sexual partners since then, never had a partner, romantic partner since then, and feels she'll always be alone. But she spent much of her time seeking spirituality. So her view of the afterlife is basically non-secular. I don't go with any religion. It's just what I pick up through everything that I've gotten my hands on and everything I've experienced. And no religion base, no type of religion or culture. And my view of the afterlife is that everybody goes there. Everybody's spirit goes there, and their soul. They go there, and there's no judge. There's no, you were bad, you were good. This is what you do for the rest of eternity. It's our own path. Our own soul is ours. And we go to the afterlife and we judge ourselves. And I thought that was a very profound way to think of the afterlife, as a person who religious institutions and doctrines, which were hoarded and co-opted by those with authority. They said that who Marla was and the disease she lived with related to her soul. Maybe not in Judaism, but in other sects that interacted with the HIV positive community and lobbied for her political rights. So whether she was part of that sect or not, people were talking about her soul. And belittling her and marginalizing her and her community. And she decided to investigate, and her view of the afterlife of judgment is that you judge yourself based on your actions and how you impact the world. And she said she doesn't want to come back to Earth because this life was so hard, and that she hopes she'll stay in the afterlife. Let's see. Right, so I will give us one last quote before saying a little bit about my personal connection to the research. One person I had the pleasure of interviewing was the Reverend Charlie, who is a minister in the Metropolitan Community Church in Waco, Texas. And while he's HIV negative, he has had a ministry to HIV positive congregants in a rural area for years. And so he's very attuned to the language that people from Christianity like him said were punishment. And he rejects this mythology and instead offers a better story, a better gospel. So I'll read a bit about what he said. In general, the response was either dead silence or it was thought to be God's punishment to the gay community. Because at that time, most of the people that we know who were dying or who were infected were gay men. And also the prostitutes and drug users, it was showing up there too. The MCC Church has been around since 1968. And so maybe about 15 years or so before the actual HIV started showing up in the country. And I remember thinking that we believe within our guts that HIV was not a death sentence from God. But still, there was that thing of, but what if? Why is this only happening to us? And so HIV actually took a great toll on the MCC denomination, both within members of the church as well as pastors. There were a great number of people who died in the early days of the epidemic. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, the MCC Church was, I think, the first denomination in the United States to ordain gays and lesbians and has since then, become one that really advocated for transgender inclusion and an inclusion of other marginalized groups way before other denominations did. And Charlie says, we became known as the church with AIDS. We were the church with AIDS, and we embraced that identity, believing that we are the body of Christ and that Christ had AIDS at that time, which is a very deep theological idea that Christ on the cross took on the sickness and the pain and humiliation. So for him, God was suffering too. God wasn't condemning, but God was suffering as the people who were stigmatized and marginalized were suffering. And if the church, the body of Christ, had AIDS, then God or Christ also had AIDS. Let's see. In one last quote I will give you from the participant Rob, he found that redemption, thinking about the term redemption, solidarity, building a better world together, which is, I think, a call on the deepest points of all of our religions, how to do justice, tikkun olam, the gospel, how to build a world that's more whole. And Rob found that that's where he found meaning. If he didn't, in Christianity. And he's talking here about the solidarity within the queer community during the epidemic's worst point in America. And he says, our culture lost something really beautiful. We really lost a sense of community because that pain really knit us together. Lesbians came and we were so together helping each other. And we really had a strong community based on caring. We had so much wisdom. We had the older gays that knew things and were passing it on, helping each other, and we lost all of that. I feel sorry that you didn't get to have that. And that's probably why I'm doing this, because I want to share a little bit that you may not get anywhere else. He says, we had nothing to lose. And once again, I actually can't see the rest of this slide, unfortunately. But he says that they could fight because they had nothing to lose. And that's where he found his calling and his redemption. You can read here, I have a little parable that I like. It's a Buddhist parable. It's about Gesar, who was a warrior king, whose uncle Trotong tried to kill. And every time he was tried to be killed, he would grow stronger and stronger. And if Trotong had never been so scheming, Gesar could never have risen so high. And lastly, to switch gears a little bit, I know we're moving kind of fast, but I want to save time at the end so we can have a little bit of a conversation. Yeah, in this research, I've really discovered my vocation for religious studies. At Baylor University, which is a very conservative university, I really was the only person I knew who was working on a senior thesis or working on oral history that had to do with LGBTQ identities. And it was very a strange thing. I had advisors tell me that they were afraid that I would get into trouble for this. It was really quite a conservative university. And I said, no, I want to do this because I love religion and I believe in its intrinsic goodness, despite the ways in which people in power have hoarded it, and hoarded the doctrine and hoarded the faith. Um, I believe that the faith should not be hoarded, but should be shared and opened. And that's why I wanted to do it. And so I did it. And as a queer person who's a Roman Catholic, I felt deeply connected to this research. I actually never knew well anybody who is HIV positive, but now I know many who are queer elders, and they have such a wisdom. It's sort of like our prophets in our religions, our teachers in our religions. They're sharing their wisdom. They're offering a bit of themselves so that we can pass it on. And now, in this global pandemic, which, by the way, happened like at the same time I was finishing this research, everything hit the fan. I really discovered that there is very little that can be taken for granted. And I sure as hell have no idea about meaning, about anything in this world. But one thing that I feel constantly inspired by is this study of religion at the margins, about death and dying, and people where religion is both the most important and hitting them the hardest, which is true for stigmatized communities, and which is true for people who are living with long-term illnesses. And at the same time as all this, everything hit the fan with Corona, and it was really a spiritual valley for me. And I had to think through it, and I said, I have this vocation for religious studies because religion is something that can make the world much, much better or much, much worse. And as a queer Catholic, I know that. I love my faith. I love my church. I love the rituals, the liturgy. Catholicism teaches us that creation is good, that God is present in all creation, and that God loves creation infinitely. That hope is always possible, that redemption is always possible, always. But the Catholic Church also teaches a lot about people not a lot. It doesn't teach a lot, but a lot of the teachers focus on those things a lot. And I think that's the difference about people like me, and people of color, and Jews, and people of non-Christian faiths, atheists and women. There are things in their sort of deposit of faith that are harmful. And so it's all this at once. And that's my faith. And I think about Jesus on the cross, dying, taking on the pain and the sorrow, and feeling all the pain. And I think that is what my church is doing to Jesus, actively killing him, but also trying to know better and better how to hear his words better and follow them better. And anyways, I want to research this stuff. And I think I would like to be a chaplain, an interfaith chaplain, in a prison or in a hospital. And this research really helped me find that. So it was truly an inspiring and humbling experience for me. And anyways, I thank you so much for listening. I haven't given a Zoom presentation like this, so hopefully it was interesting, and that you were able to follow. And so thank you very much. And at this time, if you have any questions, we can stop the recording. We can have a little bit of a conversation, whatever there's time for. So thanks again.
Thank you, Kyle.